Mr. President.
Senator from Utah is recognized.
Mr. President, I stand today to explain my no vote.
Quorum call. Senate is in a quorum call.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that we dispense with the quorum call.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I stand today to explain my no vote on cloture this morning in connection with the Sportsman's Bill, S-3525. This is a large bill. It's made up of a number of legislative proposals that have been put together. In many settings, this is a good way to legislate. In many respects, it is, and we utilize this procedure on an almost constant basis in order to make the laws of our country. Like many other pieces of legislation that come before us that have been formed in this fashion, this is a bill as to which I can say I support it in part and I don't support it in part. There are parts that I like a lot. There are other parts that I like a lot less. That's exactly why we have an amendment process. True debate in this country, especially in this body, presupposes and depends for its existence on the availability of an open amendment process. You see, when you go into a store, you can decide which items you want to buy. You can decide to buy bread and milk and eggs or any combination of the three or other products you might want. It would be disturbing if you got to the grocery store counter and were told you may not buy bread and milk and eggs unless you also buy a bucket of nails, a half-ton of iron ore, a book about cowboy poetry, and a Barry Manilow album. Sometimes that's what we're told when we get to the table to vote in the Senate. In order to get some things that you want, you have to buy a whole bunch of other things that you might not want. That is a reality of the legislative process. It's a reality that goes along with compromise, and it's one that we live with every day. But again, this is why it's important for us to have an amendment process, so that we can at least debate and discuss the relevant merits of each piece of legislation. And more importantly, so that we might figure out how to take a good piece of legislation and make it better, or how to take a bad piece of legislation and make it good. In this circumstance, the majority leader has used a procedure known as filling the tree. He filled the tree, which means, in effect, that we can't offer amendments. We can't offer any amendments other than those few that the majority leader decided could be offered. It shuts down debate. There can be no significant debate beyond that which will lead to a vote once the tree has been filled. This is a problem. Now, Republicans in this body, myself included, voted recently to proceed to this bill, believing in good faith that there would be an opportunity to amend this bill. The bill is important to me in many respects. One of the things that's gotten my attention is that it addresses a number of issues related to federal public lands. It addresses a number of other issues related to wildlife conservation, wildlife management, and other issues that are important to hunters and other outdoor enthusiasts across the country and in my state in particular. One of the reasons why this bill is especially important to me is that I represent the great state of Utah, a state that has a lot of federal land. In fact, 2/3 of the land in my state is owned by the federal government. For that and other reasons, I'd like the opportunity to address this piece of legislation by offering up amendments that would make a good bill better. But this process, a process whereby the majority leader rules this body by dictate, is not good for the Senate. We come to expect that the United States Senate will be a great deliberative body. In fact, the United States Senate has long prided itself on being the world's greatest deliberative legislative body. There are a number of realities about the Senate that make this possible, far more possible than it might be in the House of Representatives. Here in the Senate, we have only 100 members. Just down the hall in the House of Representatives, they have 435 members. In that body, it's not always possible to have an open amendment process. In this body, it is assumed. This is the usual order. This is the way we're supposed to operate, is to have an opportunity for members to offer and debate and discuss amendments in advance of voting for the procedure at the end of the day. Yet, we have not had such an opportunity in this case because the leader filled the tree. This is significant, and I want to emphasize this point. It is true, of course, that majority leaders from both political parties have utilized this procedure from time to time. For one reason or another, perhaps out of professed need to expedite the legislative process in certain instances. But this majority leader has utilized this procedure a lot more than others. In fact, he's utilized it, by my count, a total of 67 times, more than any other majority leader in history. Why, I ask, has he done this? Why did he do it in this circumstance? Why has he done it in so many other circumstances throughout this Congress and throughout his service as majority leader? Is it because the Senate has demonstrated an inability to debate and discuss bills and amendments to bills in a reasonable, responsible manner? I don't think so. Let's point to a couple of examples. For example, the National Defense Authorization Act, which this body passed toward the end of last year, the NDAA of 2011. It passed out of this body overwhelmingly, notwithstanding the fact that there were a number of amendments introduced. I believe there were dozens of amendments that were introduced, debated, discussed, and ultimately voted upon. Another example involves the Farm Bill that was passed by this body earlier this year. If I'm not mistaken, we had over 70 amendments to that bill. I appreciated the majority leader's willingness in that circumstance to allow us to have a pretty open, robust debate and discussion and an open amendment process. We still passed the bill, even though we had to conduct a lot of debate and have a lot of discussion and have a lot of votes. But this, you see, is what makes this the greatest deliberative body in the world. This is what separates us from other legislative bodies around the country and throughout this planet. So it's not the case that the Senate simply isn't responsible enough to be able to handle something like an open amendment process, because it's demonstrated its ability to do so time and time and time again. Now, let's talk about some of the things that I like in this bill. I support the fact that this bill would increase access to public lands and would remove some burdensome regulations on some activities occurring on those lands. On the other hand, I am not as wild about the fact that this bill devotes $6.5 million on neotropical migratory birds, on a program that would require 75% of those funds to be spent outside the United States. Now, I know in the big picture of things, this is a very, very small figure in terms of our total national budget. Nevertheless, this is a lot of money. It's a lot of money to hardworking Americans who are paying their taxes in order to fund programs like this. We ought at least to have an opportunity to debate and discuss amendments so that Americans can feel like their money is being spent in the United States for causes that are important to Americans and not on birds outside the United States. Other senators have other differences with the bill, other concerns. I agree with some of those concerns. I disagree with others. Each of them should have an opportunity to have those concerns aired, to have them debated and discussed in connection with amendments of their own choosing that they might choose to introduce. We should be debating all of them. Instead, in effect, we're debating none of them. That kind of process is especially important in this circumstance because, you see, this bill, as I understand it, has never gone through committee. Normally, in committee, we have an opportunity to put a bill through the markup process, to make amendments in committee. This didn't go there. All the more reason why we should have an open amendment process right here. So I have introduced several amendments. I'll refer to just a few of them. One of them would involve a proposal to not spend money that we don't have in order to support the conservation of multinational species, $150 million over 5 years. In other words, it's one thing to spend money on habitat preservation and species rehabilitation for species that actually exist in the United States. It's another thing to spend a lot of money on species outside the United States, on creatures that have never entered our borders and never will. That's something that I think Americans are concerned about, and it's something that I think we ought to have a chance to debate and discuss as long as we are debating and discussing and voting on this legislation. I have another piece of legislation that would require state legislative approval for any new federal land designations. As I said a few minutes ago, with the federal government owning 2/3 of the land in my state, I'm especially concerned about the possibility of, for example, the President deciding to just designate a new national monument within my state. This happened a few years ago when President Clinton designated the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument inside Utah. He didn't go to Utah to announce it. He went to Arizona to announce it. This is beautiful land. It's beautiful territory. But all of this was accomplished by the stroke of the pen for one chief executive without any opportunity for input from Utah, from its 3 million residents, from its elected officials. And I think that any time the federal government takes this kind of action, action that will have a profound impact on the state, on its sovereign rights, on its ability to raise revenue, on its ability to encourage and promote economic activity within its boundaries, there ought to be input, there ought to be approval from the state legislature. I have an amendment that would address this concern. I have another amendment that would offer certain federal lands for disposal by a competitive sale process. We have an enormous amount of land in this country. Some of it is being put to good use. Other land is being set aside because of its wilderness characteristics. Other land still is just sitting there not doing anything. I think some of that land could be sold, and some of that money could be used to fund our programs that are cash-strapped, along with everything else in this country right now. These and other amendments need to receive consideration. I'm not saying that every one of them has to pass in order for this legislation to proceed, but every one of them ought to be discussed. Every one of them ought to be debated. The American people should have an opportunity to have their input through their own elected U.S. senators. I would deeply regret it if this were somehow an indication that our majority leader intends to operate the Senate this way, not only throughout the duration of this Congress, but into the next Congress as well. I want to be clear that I have great respect and admiration for our majority leader. I've known him for most of my life, since I was 11 years old, in fact. I consider him a friend. I ask him, I implore him as my friend, to reconsider this practice of filling the tree and thereby forestalling the introduction of amendments. We need an open amendment process. Our status as the world's greatest deliberative legislative body requires nothing less. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. President.
The Republican leader is recognized.
I ask consent that further proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection, so ordered.
Last evening, the majority leader had a second cloture vote on S. 3414, the Lieberman cybersecurity bill. This vote to end debate on a comprehensive, complex bill that was never reported out of committee or subject to a markup came despite the fact that not a single amendment, except for those used to fill the amendment tree, was allowed to be made pending to the bill. The majority leader had made prior commitments to allowing a free and open debate on cybersecurity, a matter that Republicans acknowledge must be addressed, especially in the areas of information sharing and providing some degree of liability protection to those companies that do share cyber threat information with one another and the federal government. Yet, despite this commitment, the majority leader triggered this second cloture vote on the bill and filled the amendment tree throughout floor consideration of cybersecurity legislation. Now, the Senate will hopefully move to a full and open debate on the defense authorization bill during the time that that bill is considered on the floor, and I do expect that bill to be subject to an open amendment process. My hope is that the majority leader will work with me to reach an agreement on allowing a debate on cybersecurity legislation with Republican amendments in order, especially since the ranking members of Armed Services, Intelligence, Commerce, and Judiciary are all co-sponsors of a cybersecurity bill that needs to be considered as part of this debate. Now, my expectation is that sometime in December, after we've completed floor debate on the defense authorization bill and then dispose of the intelligence authorization bill, we will then attempt to get an agreement on amendments to the cybersecurity bill. Now, Mr. President, on another matter, I want to pay tribute to a close personal friend of mine of over 40 years, a Kentuckian who is a hero to his country and an inspiration to many for his work on behalf of children, where he has made a national impact. In his 23 years of service as President and Chief Executive Officer of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, Ernie Allen has saved thousands of lives and reunited thousands of families. Today, November 15th, Ernie retires from the helm of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, a private, nonprofit center which he co-founded. Under his leadership, the National Center assisted in the recovery of more than 178,000 missing children. They've trained almost 300,000 law enforcement and criminal justice professionals in policy and protocols for missing children investigations. And they have achieved a missing child recovery rate of 97.7%. Losing Ernie's talents at the National Center will be a loss for Kentucky as well as for the nation. Kentucky was proud to have one of our own leading this important cause. I've known Ernie for over 40 years, dating back to our days at Manual High School in Louisville. On the same day I won election as president of the student body of the high school, he was elected president of the junior high portion of the same school. We both went on to attend the University of Louisville and were actually fraternity brothers there. Knowing Ernie so well, I can assure you that his dedication to rescuing missing children runs very deep. Over 25 years ago, when I was judge executive in Jefferson County, and that's a position that is the head of the executive branch of county government, Ernie was the director of the Louisville-Jefferson County Crime Commission. Louisville, of course, is the major city located within Jefferson County, and in fact, these days, the city and county governments have merged. That was not the case, however, in those days, and we in the county government had to coordinate and work with officials in city government. This Louisville-Jefferson County Crime Commission was one of the best examples of cooperation between city and county government back in those days. That commission was the first of its kind to bring police officers and social workers together on behalf of kids. Just one innovation Ernie came up with back then was to make a fingerprint card for as many Kentucky kids as possible and send that card home to the child's parents to use to assist investigators in the awful event the child ever went missing. Ernie's work in Kentucky established him as a national leader in his field as early as 1981. At that time, no nationwide organization existed to share and distribute information on missing children. If a child was abducted and taken over a state line or even a county line, the chances that law enforcement in the new jurisdiction had all the information necessary to save that child were really quite small. Ernie led the effort to lobby Congress to establish laws so that police could talk to each other across boundaries about these missing children. His work and patience bore fruit in 1984 when President Reagan signed the bill creating the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children as a public-private partnership. So Ernie was an integral part of the founding of the National Center. He then became its president and CEO in 1989. He's been a nationally recognized authority in combating child abduction and exploitation for decades. The U.S. Justice Department sought out his expertise in the wake of the tragic child murders in Chicago and Atlanta. Congress has sought his expert testimony many, many times on issues ranging from international child abduction to missing children to online crimes against children. Ernie worked to secure the passage of the National Child Search Assistance Act, which prohibits waiting periods for initiating missing child investigations. Previously, some law enforcement agencies refused to take reports of missing children until a certain period of time had elapsed. Now, thanks to Ernie, there are no unnecessary bureaucratic delays in cases where any hesitancy can be the difference in returning an abducted child to their parents or opening a murder investigation. Ernie advocated for the Amber Alert program, which has to date saved 600 abducted children. Today, there's an Amber Alert plan in every single state. Ernie has always recognized the critical role technology plays in these rescue efforts, from the Amber Alert to his spearheading the launch of the National Center's cyber tip line in 1998. This so-called 911 for the Internet is a clearing center for reports of crimes against children on the Internet, and so far has received more than 1.5 million reports. Ernie is a lawyer and a member of the Kentucky Bar. He's also a teacher, having held faculty positions at the University of Louisville, the University of Kentucky, and Indiana University. He's been honored by his alma mater, the University of Louisville, as a distinguished alumnus of the Lewis Brandeis School of Law and as an outstanding alumnus of the College of Arts and Sciences. I'm pleased to report to my colleagues that Ernie will not be leaving the fight for America's kids. No, his passion won't allow him to take a typical retirement. We're lucky that even as he's stepping down from his role at the helm of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, he'll now focus exclusively on his new role as President and CEO of the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Mr. President, if there was some way for me to express the gratitude that thousands, literally thousands of American families have for Ernie and the National Center, I certainly would. But that seems impossible. Imagine the relief of just one family who fears the worst about a missing son or daughter, and then, thanks to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, is reunited with their child safe and sound. Multiply that by tens of thousands, and you will only just begin to see the enormous difference Ernie has made during his career. So I'm honored to say that I've watched and admired his work for many years, and I'm honored to call him a friend. Thank you, Ernie, for your great contribution to the cause of justice. Madam President, I wrote Ernie a letter congratulating him on his career and wishing him well upon his retirement. And I ask unanimous consent that that letter appear in the record at this point.
Without objection.
And, Madam President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Madam President.
The senator from Virginia.
Madam President, are we in a quorum?
Yes.
I'd ask that the proceedings of the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Madam President, I rise today to join my colleague and friend, the Senator from Delaware, Chris Coons, in introducing legislation that will make voting faster and more accessible to all voters. Here we are barely a week after a historic election in 2012. And I can't speak about North Carolina, but in Virginia, it's remarkable. In 2012, people had to wait for hours in line to vote. In Prince William County, folks waited for up to 3 hours. In Chesapeake, Virginia, folks waited up to 4 hours. It was remarkable that it was 5 days after the fact before we even knew the results in Florida. 21st century, in the greatest democracy in the world, voting shouldn't be this much of a burden. And in many ways, when you have those kind of extraordinary lines, particularly if you're working, what we in effect have created is a 21st century poll tax. And those of us in the South who have a history where poll taxes were used to restrict voters, what you in effect have by having these extensive lines, if you are work on an hourly basis or can only get off a bit of time, and you can't afford to wait 3 and 4 and 5 hours in line to vote. This legislation, the Fair, Accurate, Secure, and Timely Voting Act of 2012, the so-called FAST Act, creates a competitive grant program to encourage states to aggressively pursue election reforms. It would provide incentives for states like Virginia to invest in practices and technology designed to expedite voting at the polls and simplify voter registration. The FAST Voting Act addresses this issue in a responsible way. It doesn't add new mandates. It authorizes simply additional resources for those states which step up with common-sense reforms to make voting faster and more accessible to voters. This is a relatively very small program, but a few dollars spent to both increase the process, increase the number of voting machines at those polling places that are so restricted, would, I believe, remove some of the embarrassment that Virginia and so many other states saw last week when people had to wait so long. I encourage Virginia's elected leaders to embrace this opportunity to improve access for Virginia voters who should not have to wait in line for hours to exercise their most basic constitutional right, the right to vote. As I mentioned, this bill authorizes a federal program that would award grants based on how well applicant states, again, states will be the decision makers whether they'd want to apply for this program, are able to improve access to the polls in at least 9 specific ways. Let me just simply mention 3 of those. For one, provide absentee voting, including no-excuse absentee voting. We in Virginia still have restrictions on pre-vote. 2, providing assistance to voters who do not speak English as a primary language. Virginia, North Carolina, other states are becoming more diverse, and we need to accommodate those voters. And then auditing and reducing waiting time at polling stations. Again, no one in the 21st century should have to wait 4 or 5, and as some reported cases in Florida, up to 7 or 8 hours to vote. This program, this, again, voluntary grant program, also requires the establishment of performance measures and reporting requirements to ensure a state's progress in eliminating statutory, regulatory, procedural, and other barriers to expedited voting and accessible voter registration. This is a relatively small bill. I want to commend, though, my colleague, the senator from Delaware, Senator Coons, for taking the lead. I join him as a co-sponsor on this. And regardless on which side of the aisle you stand, in 2012 and surely before 2016, we ought to not have a repeat of this 21st century poll tax that is imposed on folks all across America by not being able to exercise their vote or have to pay a too high a price or have the kind of embarrassment where it takes us literally days and days for the public to get the results. Madam President, I hope my colleagues will join me in supporting this legislation. And with that,
The senator from Vermont.
Madam President, what is the parliamentary situation? Are we in morning business, or?
We are post-cloture on S. 3525.
I thank the distinguished presiding officer. I'd ask consent to proceed for no more than 5 minutes as though in morning business, and then resume back in the normal regular order.
Without objection.
Madam President, Vermont is a small state, but it's filled with very big people. Perhaps none are better known or more well-liked and more respected than Antonio Parmelo. He's the Vermont Chamber of Commerce 2012 Vermont Citizen of the Year. Vermonters know Tony Parmelo by many names. Either call him Mr. P or Tony. My wife Marcelle and I also have the good fortune of calling him Uncle Tony. He is my wife's uncle, and they have a family bond which I admire. But no matter what we call him, we all agree the best term to describe Uncle Tony is generous. This is not the first time I've come to the floor of the Senate to share stories of Tony Parmalo's good deeds. Only 6 years ago, the Burlington Free Press named him the 2006 Vermonter of the Year. After the editorial, I came to the floor to tell the story of a successful real estate magnate turned philanthropist who touched the lives of thousands of Vermonters over the past several decades. That time he was 89 years old. But this year, Tony's undertaken a series of good deeds so substantial it'd be irresponsible if we Vermonters did not acknowledge him with additional recognition and praise. In addition to his unwavering philanthropic commitment to Vermont, this year Tony demonstrated why he is seen as a pillar of our community. I might say a granite pillar of our community. When Tropical Storm Irene destroyed people's homes, Tony immediately donated $1 million to put them back together. When a decades-long struggle to save a mobile home park in Shelburne, Vermont seemed destined to fail, well, Uncle Tony showed up to rebuild the neighborhood and donate it to the residents. And when his hometown, Newport, Vermont, which is also Marcel's birthplace, began discussing ways to reinvigorate its beautiful waterfront, Tony offered to lead the way. Now, these three activities over a lifetime, any one of them would warrant a lifetime achievement. Tony Parmalo did them all in 1 year at the age of 95. This year's very public good deeds go hand in hand with a lifetime of public and private philanthropy. His generosity has touched tens of thousands of Vermonters, from college students at St. Michael's College, where he's been a leading benefactor, to the struggling families who attend his community Christmas parties, to the families of our deployed Vermont National Guard members who were able to come together in celebrations together with Tony's support. Perhaps the best gift Tony Parmalo has given Vermont is a sense of community and work ethic he's instilled in his family and employees. He and his wife Rita had 10 children, 8 of whom remain with us today. And often one of his many grandchildren travels with him when he goes around the state. Vermont is a better place thanks to Tony and his good deeds. And on behalf of all Vermonters, I thank the Vermont Chamber of Commerce for spotlighting Antonio Parmalo's good works on behalf of his beloved fellow Vermonters. Madam President, I ask consent that my full statement be placed in the record.
Without objection.
Madam President, I have 5 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders. I ask unanimous consent these requests be agreed to and these requests be printed in the record.
Without objection.
Madam President, I see nobody on the floor seeking recognition. I would suggest the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
The Senate is working today on what's called the Sportsman's Bill. It expands hunting and fishing on federal land. Members voted this morning to limit debate to 30 more hours. In the meantime, senators are in a quorum call, waiting for a senator to come to the floor. While we wait, we're going to take you live to the Economic Club of Washington, where the chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors is speaking about economic issues facing the U.S.
Alan Kruger. Alan is a native of New Jersey. He went to undergrad at Cornell, where he was not only top of his class, but a high jumper on the track team. Then went to Harvard to get his Ph.D. in economics, and his thesis advisor was none other than Larry Summers. He has an academic career and is now has been a named professor at Princeton, teaching economics, but is now on his second tour of duty in the Obama administration. At the beginning of the Obama administration, he served as Assistant Secretary of Economic Affairs at Treasury, and then went back to Princeton, and then was lured back by the President to become the Chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, a position he assumed about a year ago, confirmed in November of 2011. So we're very pleased to have you here, Alan. And so everybody wants to know one thing. Are we going to fall off the fiscal cliff or not? What's the answer?
The answer is that we shouldn't. These are solvable problems. We are working away at them. The President yesterday met with business leaders to discuss end-of-the-year issues, the fiscal cliff, also other issues of concerns to business. The day before, he met with labor leaders, other leaders, and the President's approach to this problem has been clear all along. He is looking for a balanced solution, a solution that is balanced in terms of raising additional revenue, raised from the most fortunate top 2% of income earners in the U.S., also which reduces spending. So I think the President's position has been clear. These are solvable problems. We have it within our capacity to solve them. It's a matter of the political will.
Okay, so let's talk about the process. To put it in context, how much revenue does the President want to pick up? Let's use 10-year numbers. Over the next 10 years, what would he like to have as a solution that you can get in the lame duck session? How much revenue is he trying to pick up?
Well, what I would point people to is the President's budget. The President's budget has in it about $1.5 trillion of additional revenue.
Over 10 years. Over
the 10-year budget window. And also step back and say, what's the goal of the President's budget? The goal of the President's budget is to put the U.S. on a sustainable fiscal path, to put us in a position where our debt is not rising relative to the size of the economy, as well as to support the economy in the short run and make the important investments that we need to make so that we remain the most competitive, productive nation on earth.
Well, right now, the President's talked about in the campaign having marginal rates go up for the upper 2%. And as the people make $250 and above, or the upper 2%. So he would like, as I remember, to take the marginal rate from 35 to 39.6. But does he also want, as part of that, to have deduction limitations for that element, or is he just happy to get the increase in marginal rates?
We'd like to see a tax code that's more fair, that's more efficient. The President laid that out in his budgets. What the President has laid out in his budget is an increase in the top rates back to where they were in the Clinton years, which, as you know, were very successful years for the economy, as well as a broader base, which most economists would agree is a way of having a more efficient tax code.
What about the capital gains rate? It's now 15%. Does the President want it to go to 20%? Is that an essential part of this package that he's negotiating now?
You know, again, if you look at what the President wants, that's what he put in his budget.
Okay.
And as you know, that's the rate in the budget. The President also made very clear yesterday that he's open to new ideas. But I think we have to be clear-eyed when we look at this problem. The U.S. can't afford the tax cuts that were passed 10 years ago, over 10 years ago now, and feels that the most fair way to address our revenue shortfall is by raising revenue from the very top.
Okay. Explain to everybody, if you would. Right now, we have roughly $16 trillion of total federal debt, not counting Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Under Bowles-Simpson, it was projected that we would probably have, if no budget policy changes occurred, another $10 trillion of debt over the next 10 years, roughly. Is that right? No, so you'd have 10 plus 16, 26 trillion. Bowles-Simpson said reduce the 10 by 4, more or less. So you'd still have, even if you had Bowles-Simpson, 6 trillion added to the 16 trillion. Why is that okay to have 22 trillion of debt in 10 years? I mean, why is that still considered a good thing to do?
Not specifically about Bowles-Simpson. We're going to have a much larger economy 10 years from now. And what's important is that we can meet our financing needs, and the best metric of our capacity to do that is the size of the debt relative to the economy. So what the President has proposed, and Bowles-Simpson as well, is to put us on a path where the debt is stabilized or coming down relative to GDP, relative to the size of the economy.
So it'd be roughly still 100% of GDP, and you think our economy can sustain 100% of GDP debt, more or less? I assume you do.
No, I would also explain a little bit about the numbers. So this $16 trillion figure that you mentioned includes debt that we owe to ourselves. So I don't think that's an appropriate way of thinking about, I mean, it's a measure of debt, but it's not the measure of debt that I think that's most economically relevant. What's most economically relevant is debt owed to the public outside of the government,
and that's
which is
10 to 12?
Which is closer to 12, and you're talking about 75, you know, we're talking about being on a path where it's 75, 76% of GDP.
Okay. The unemployment rate became an issue in the campaign. The unemployment rate went down below 8%, went down to 7.8, then 7.9. Some people said that maybe the numbers had been played with by some people. Who knows who were doing that. Can you assure people that nothing improper happened on the unemployment rate?
Claims that there was political manipulation of the unemployment rate are truly absurd. I've watched the Bureau of Labor Statistics for a long time. I worked in the mid-90s as chief economist at the Labor Department, where I interacted with the BLS. The unemployment rate is assembled by career employees who are dedicated to their craft. They use the same methods that they've used over a period of years. They are insulated from the politics. They inform us of the unemployment rate after they have calculated it. At the moment, there's no political appointee at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, because at the moment there's not a confirmed commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So this entire enterprise, which is probably the most respected statistical organization in the world, or certainly among the most respected in the world, I think is really beyond reproach when it comes to the integrity of their data.
And do they call you the day before, and they release it and give you the numbers, and you can give them to the President the day before, so at least you know what they're going to be before they're announced?
The long-standing procedure is that they share the unemployment report with us the afternoon before it's released. The Office of Management and Budget set up procedures back in the 1970s which govern how we transmit that to the President. And that's the procedures that we follow. And other administrations have followed, the Bush administration, the Clinton administration.
So, so the President doesn't say to you, could you see if they could lower it a little bit more, nothing like that?
The President has never
said
that to me.
Okay. So today, we measure...
Nor to anyone.
We measure unemployment by people who are looking for jobs in the last 4 weeks, more or less. Why is that the appropriate measure of the unemployment rate? Some people say the appropriate measure is people who would really like jobs but have stopped looking, and that rate would be 14.5%, something like that. Can you explain why we do it this way, and do other countries do it the same way?
That's an excellent question. We started in the 1940s to regularly measure the unemployment rate. And to be unemployed, by the definition the Bureau of Labor Statistics has used for decades, 3 conditions need to be met. Someone needs to be without a job in the reference week. They need to have made some active effort to find a job in the preceding 4 weeks, where active effort means they took some action that could have resulted in them getting a job offer, as opposed to just reading help wanted ads or browsing the web. They need to file an application or go on a job interview and so on. And number 3, they need to be available for work. Because it may be the case that someone is searching for a job, but because of other obligations would not be able to work in that survey week. So those 3 conditions need to be met. That's the same definition that most other countries use. There are international agreements to try to harmonize the way we measure unemployment. Now, in the U.S., starting in the 1980s, we have added a broader set of measures of labor underutilization, which include people who have given up looking for a job because they don't think one is available. Includes people who are working part-time but would like a full-time job, and they haven't been able to find a full-time job. So we have a whole suite of measures. The official unemployment rate, I think, is economically quite meaningful. If we look at the relationship between a host of other variables and the unemployment rate, we find pretty stable relationships. Moreover, if we look at people who, if you look at people's behavior, which is the way economists like to judge measures, we find that people who have searched for a job in the last 4 weeks are a lot more likely to make a transition to finding a job than are people who say they would like a job but they haven't looked in the last year. So these are economically meaningful measures. We have a whole suite so people can look at a variety of these measures. Importantly, David, they all show that the unemployment rate has come down. We'd like it to come down more, and the President has proposed actions to bring the unemployment rate down further, but they all are painting a similar picture of an economy that's slowly healing.
Normally, after a recession, 2 years after the recession is over, this recession is officially over June 2009, the unemployment rate pretty much has gone back to where it was before the recession. But why in this recession has it not gone anywhere close to the pre-recession level?
This was a very different recession than the typical post-war recession. This was a recession that destroyed a tremendous amount of wealth, that disrupted the financial system, and research has found that financial crises tend to lead to deeper recessions, particularly crises that affect the housing market, which is where most Americans have the largest amount of their wealth, and they're just slower to recover from, and the hole is deeper. We have seen the unemployment rate come down about 2 points from the peak. We want to keep working on that progress, to build on that progress. That's why the President has proposed in his budget funds to invest more in infrastructure, funds to help state and local governments keep teachers on the payroll, and other actions that will help the economy in the short run, even while we address the longer-term fiscal problems.
1 year from today, what do you think the unemployment rate will be?
I have to give you the following answer. We make projections twice a year.
Okay.
And we are in the process right now of finalizing our projections for the budget, which goes to the, just to tell you a little bit of the background. The Council of Economic Advisors, together with the Treasury Department and the Office of Management and Budget, form the Troika, the forecasting group. And one needs to have forecasts of the future path of the economy for the budget. As part of the budget process, we make these forecasts, then we update them, typically during the summer.
Right.
And I'm not going to front-run our budget
well, just give
forecast.
us a hint. Would it be, would you think it could be lower or more likely to be lower? I assume it'll be lower, no?
You know, I think if we take the actions the President has been calling for, the unemployment rate will be lower. I think the right economic path is pretty clear. I think it's what the President has called for in terms of addressing our fiscal problems, protecting the middle class. The Senate passed an extension of the middle class tax cuts. That could take a good deal of the concern, the anxiety over the fiscal cliff right off the table if the House of Representatives were to do what the Senate did and pass that bill. And also continue to support the economy in the short run. Those actions are taken. I'm quite confident that you'll see a continued decline in the unemployment rate.
When I went to college, the Samuelson textbooks used to say full employment, more or less, in the United States was 4% or 4.5% or 5%. What do you consider today full employment?
You know, if you look at our budgets, if you look at sort of the out years when we think the economy has recovered from this very deep crisis that began back at the end of 2007, we have the unemployment rate in the 5% range. And there are a lot of factors that affect the natural rate of unemployment, some having to do with the demographic structure of the population. And if you want to get some sense of what we think the steady state unemployment rate is, you look at, you know, year 9, 10 of our budget.
Okay, now, you give advice to the President on economic affairs. How would you've advised a lot of business people, government officials over the years. How would you rate his economics quotient? Does he understand economics? And do you think he picks up everything about the economy that you tell him?
Well, first of all, as you know, no good advisor goes into details about their advising. I will say it's been a great honor to work for President Obama. I didn't expect that I would return to Washington, only because of the tremendous respect I have for the President and what he's trying to accomplish, that I did agree to come back after having served at the Treasury for 2 years. And in a way, it's kind of similar to the experience I had when I was at Treasury, to work for someone who could do your job better than you. And that's been the experience I've had working for the President.
So when you were at Princeton teaching economics, was Ben Bernanke there as well?
Ben and I were colleagues for many years. Ben, I like to point out, before he was chairman of the Fed, before he was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, even before he was chairman of the Princeton Economics Department, he was chairman of my tenure review committee.
Okay. So you have a very high regard for him, I guess.
Yes. The man has wonderful judgment.
Right. Okay. Okay. And do you expect he'll be coming back to Princeton anytime soon?
You know, I can't comment on his plans.
Well, he held this position, and Arthur Burns held this position, and Alan Greenspan held this position that you now hold, and they all went on to be chairman of the Federal Reserve. So do you have any interest in being chairman of the Federal Reserve?
My interest is in seeing the economy recover as best as it can. And it's been a wonderful opportunity for me to serve the President, serve the country in this capacity. And it really is, and I'm sure that all past chairmen of the Council feel this way, a tremendous opportunity to use our training to be in a position to provide objective advice to the President, which is what he asked for. He told me to stay out of the politics, to give him the unvarnished objective advice that the economics profession can provide.
The President has said he would like to protect the middle class, and obviously he would, but the middle class really would be a much lower than the $250,000 number. Explain to me why he says the middle class, he wants to protect them, but $250,000 is 2% of the population. The middle class would be something like $70,000 for a family of four. Why not decrease or get rid of the tax cuts for people with incomes of $100,000, because they're presumably middle class or above middle class?
No, there are lots of different definitions of the middle class, and for analytical purposes, many of them are very useful. I think one way of thinking about this issue is we've had an opportunity gap in this country, and that goes back more than 1 decade, where people who are not born to fortunate circumstances have much greater challenges moving upwards in the American economy. That has taken place for a number of reasons related to technology, related to globalization. And what I think is important about our proposals is that by asking the top 2% to pay more, that will provide more opportunity for others to have the same types of chances that they've had. So, for example, what is that extra revenue going to be used for? It's going to be used to help keep student loan rates low. It's going to be used to provide STEM education, science, technology, mathematics, engineering education, for more individuals to have the kinds of opportunities that have made it possible for so many Americans to thrive. And if you look at what has happened to the distribution of income in the U.S. over the last 30 years, we've seen the very top pull away. It's wonderful that they've done so well. What's important is that we pursue the policies that will reduce this opportunities gap and provide more opportunity for those from the middle and lower income families.
So do you think that 10 years from today our budget deficit is likely to be under $500 billion a year? Or what would you project the budget deficit to be? We're now running a $1.1 trillion deficit. Where do you think it realistically will be?
Right. Well, what I would like to see is for the President's fiscal path to be enacted. So again, I'm going to refer you and the audience to the President's budget. And the President inherited an economy where the deficit was exploding, where policies were baked in from the previous administration that were going to cause the deficit to rise even more. Then on top of that, the Great Recession reduced revenue and required additional spending to help families through these very difficult times. So all of that was kind of the starting conditions. What I would like to see over the next 10 years is for us to make the kinds of efforts that will put us in a place where we're on a sustainable path, where the debt is not growing, where it's manageable, where it's not crowding out private sector investment when the private sector is closer to full employment.
So the dollar, you think the dollar is in reasonably good shape, and you expect the dollar to appreciate in value against the euro or against the RMB over the next year or so?
Well, this will reveal that I spent 2 years at the Treasury. And what I learned there is that it makes a lot of sense to leave the Treasury Secretary sole voice on the value of the dollar.
Okay.
For good reasons. I mean, we don't want to send mixed signals, and I'll let you ask Secretary Geithner that question.
Well, I'll see if I can track him down and ask him. But, so, what about the euro? You're allowed to comment on the euro? Can you comment on that?
Good try.
No, you can't comment on that either. Okay. So, what propelled you to go into economics? Was it excitement about the profession? What is it that why did you decide you wanted to be an economist?
That's a wonderful question. When I started college, I had no idea about the field of economics. I didn't study economics in high school. The only thing I knew when I started college was in the history course I took, I was assigned a wonderful book called The Worldly Philosophers. So I knew a little bit about Adam Smith and Keynes and Thorstein Veblen. When I started in college, I had every intention of becoming a lawyer. I found economics remarkably attractive as a discipline in a number of respects. Attractive as a field to do research where I felt we have a body of principles that make up economics, but they're largely untested. And my interests were in trying to do empirical analysis to say where does the standard model do well and where does it need to change. Secondly...
So were your parents disappointed when you told them you weren't going to be a lawyer? No?
No.
No, they weren't.
No.
And what was it
No,
like?
they were rather indifferent, actually. But let me also add, David, because I think it's important. One of the reasons why I wanted to be a lawyer is I thought being a lawyer is one way to help people who needed help. And you think about some of the major court cases that provided more opportunity for children to go to school, for example, and Brown v. Board as an example. So I thought that law is a field which could help people who are in need of help. I thought economics was very much the same kind of field, and in fact what I liked about economics is it made you think really deeply about the solutions to those problems.
And what was Larry Summers like as a thesis advisor? Was he easy to work for?
Larry was a wonderful advisor. Larry, I was actually very fortunate in my education, both undergraduate and graduate school. Larry happened to return to Harvard just when I was starting as a graduate student. And I had macroeconomics class from him, and then public finance, and then I worked as his research assistant, and we wrote 2 papers together in graduate school. And what was wonderful about Larry is that he thought big. And I remember he said, it takes just as much work to write a paper which is unimportant as it does to write a paper that's important. Why not try to write a paper that's important, going to influence people's views on important subjects? And he was very encouraging to me and to my classmates.
So your thesis advisor was Larry Summers. Your tenure advisor, I guess, was Ben Bernanke. Who is smarter, Larry Summers or Ben Bernanke? You've worked on both of them. Who's smarter?
They're both brilliant, and they're both extraordinarily talented in what they do.
So if we were to fall off the fiscal cliff, so-called, what would be the impact on the GDP of the United States? Would it be a 5% reduction in GDP or something like that?
It's a very good question. And I think the way an economist would think about it is, what does it mean to fall off the fiscal cliff? Does it mean that we quickly work these problems out after tax rates return to their higher levels? Or does it mean that we never go back? Which is an important consideration. And what economics is pretty good at is calculating the cash flow consequences of different tax policies, different spending policies. How much money do families have to spend? How much money is the government putting into the economy for defense purchases and other things? That we can calculate pretty well. If it's a temporary fall off the fiscal cliff, the cash flow consequences are not all that great. And families, if they know it's temporary, can, in many cases, smooth over those effects. What's, to me, much more worrisome is the psychological effects of falling off of the cliff in a number of respects. First, I think it would mean to many people that the government is not capable of solving problems that it's there to solve. That's obviously not very good for confidence. I think the uncertainty of not addressing these problems will have an effect on business behavior and then later on household behavior. And those, in the short term, could be considerably larger than just the cash flow effects.
Now, when I was in the government, we had to worry about something you haven't mentioned that you don't worry about anymore. It was inflation. We managed to get it to 19%, very difficult to do that. And do you worry about inflation at all now, or is it just something that it's not even in your lexicon anymore?
Obviously, we monitor inflation. Obviously, we try to interpret movements in prices. The focus from my corner of the world has been more on some relative price movements, price of energy, price of food. The overall level of inflation, as you point out, has been quite low, and the division that we have, of course, is that the Federal Reserve is most focused on policies related to inflation, and they've been addressing that situation, I think, quite well.
Now, if the President called you and said, I know what our economy is doing because I talk to people all the time, but I really don't know what the Chinese economy is doing. I can't really understand their numbers. What's the growth rate in China? I suppose the President asked you. What would you tell him the GDP growth rate is in China these days?
That's a really good question. I would have to consult with a lot of people myself in order to answer that.
So you have no view now on whether it's growing at 7%, 6.5%, 7.5%, or that's not something you focus on as much?
It's I have enough trouble focusing on the U.S. economy, I have to say. China's economy has been slowing down. What I think is important from our perspective as well is that we address some of the imbalances that we have with the Chinese economy, which means partly that their consumption increases. But understanding the numbers is, their statistical system is a challenge.
Now, you're a labor economist, and so we've talked about the unemployment rate, but if you are a white male living in Washington, D.C., and you have a graduate degree and you're 40 years old, what's your chance of being unemployed compared to, say, a black teenager living in the District of Columbia?
It's certainly much lower, and this relates to the opportunity gap I mentioned earlier as well. It's partly a skills gap, it's partly a historical gap, and we have long-standing differences in unemployment by race in the U.S. and by age. There are vast differences in the unemployment rate by educational attainment, for example.
Now, my generation, the so-called baby boomer generation, a lot of them lost their jobs in the recession, and they decided to retire. So the result is the labor force is smaller than it's been in many years. Is that a reason why the unemployment rate isn't actually higher than it is, because the labor force is smaller? Can you explain that?
It's an excellent question. The labor force participation rate peaked in 2000. And we have had many cross currents affecting the share of the population that's either employed or looking for a job. That's the labor force. On the one hand, the labor force participation rate for men has been declining for several decades. For over 30 years has been declining. For women, up until 2000, labor force participation rate had been rising. Then it peaked around 2000 and has been gradually coming down since then. So what was boosting the labor force participation rate was labor force participation rate of women. Then the last group I would highlight is teenagers. For teenagers, in part because school enrollment has risen, labor force participation has declined. And in the long run, I think that's a healthy development for the U.S. economy because we'll have better educated workforce. Now, your question about the drop in the labor force participation rate, a good chunk of it is just a result of past trends because of demographics, because we have more people in retirement years. If you look at the drop in the unemployment rate in the last year, in the last 12 months, the unemployment rate has come down from 8.9% to 7.9%. That's entirely a result of more people finding work. So the improvement that we've seen over the last year is all a result of more people finding work. And what we want to do is keep pursuing the actions that have helped to bring about this improvement.
Okay, let's see if we have some questions from our members. Anybody, just raise your hand back here. There's a mic. Not just stand up, identify yourself.
So David asked the question whether the president understood economics. I'm going to ask whether he understands the difference between income and wealth. In the District of Columbia, there's some 80-plus cops who make over $110,000 a year. And a really good teacher in a bad part of the city teaching something people really need can make $145,000. That's Rob Cortell, by the way. So they make more than $250,000. Do you think they think they're wealthy?
I'm not entirely sure your salary numbers are right, but if you look at what's happened to the U.S. Over the last 30 years, we've had a pulling apart of the income distribution. And the group that's done particularly well is the top 2%. And they did also quite well when their taxes rose under the Clinton years. And in fact, after tax, their situation improved. So the President's economic strategy has been to pursue a balanced approach where we address the fiscal problems that have been building over a very long period of time, the economic problems that have been building over a very long period of time, by asking all Americans to make contributions. The spending cuts are going to fall disproportionately on middle-class families. The increase in tax revenue that the President has called for will fall on the top 2%. And 98% of Americans, 97% of small businesses won't be affected by the change in taxes that the President has called for and wouldn't be affected by the bill that the Senate passed. And I think one way of addressing our problems very quickly is for that bill to pass through the Congress, through the House.
Okay, other questions? Yes, right here. Okay.
Yeah, Paul Horvath from Orchard. The question for you is, if you listen to what former President Clinton said before the third debate, or some of the stuff that former Labor Secretary Rep. Rice said, they both said the same version of the following. They said, of course, for the markets, for the long-term sustainability of the economy, we have to fix the deficit. And what Clinton said is, let's go ahead and get that deal and make it ironclad, but delay it for a year or two. Because what we need right now is continuation of stimulus, which is really reflective of what he said when he was standing by President Obama's side when they extended the Bush tax cuts. So the question is do you agree in the conversations that you're having that we need to have a grand bargain and it needs to go into effect right away? Or do you agree with this, get the grand bargain, but delay it for a year or two, as some people, even in the Democratic side of this debate, have argued?
My job is economic policy advisor. So I really am best leaving the politics of all of this to someone else. I can tell you as an economist, the right strategy is to get our fiscal house in order, make lasting commitments to show that we can do that and that we're going to do that. That requires additional revenue as well as spending cuts. And we also want to help the economy in the short run. Now, the President proposed tax cuts that actually would help the economy in the short run. The worst kind of stimulus is tax cuts for the wealthy. The group that has the lowest marginal propensity to consume are the wealthy. The Congressional Budget Office last week released a report which concluded that extending the middle-class tax cuts would create 1.6 million jobs compared to allowing them to expire. And those at the very top, it was only around 200,000. And that misses the fact that if you take the revenue raised from allowing the top rates to expire and use that to do things like hire more school teachers, use it to provide unemployment benefits for those who are unemployed, or use it for infrastructure investment, that will create additional jobs. I think that's the best way to support the economy in the short run, and as well as to help us in the long run, because of course the students will benefit from the additional science and math teachers, and the economy will benefit in the future from that infrastructure investment.
Okay, another question right here.
But could you talk about Social Security and some of the so-called pork barrel programs and Medicare? I think this is a part of the solution that is consistently overlooked.
You mean talk about the entitlements and what's going to happen with them? Or, in 30 words or less.
I appreciate that. You know, first of all, I'd like to refer people to the President's budget, because one of the things we learned last week is it's been a bit of a revelation to many that the President had in his budget $1.6 trillion of additional revenue. He also has in his budget some pretty serious reforms to the health programs, which ultimately are the driver of our long-term budget deficit. So the President said he's open to new ideas, to creative solutions. And in the budget, I think there are many proposals that will address the entitlement issue.
Okay, we have time for one more question. We have another question. Right here, right here. Last question. You just stand up.
Hello. I have a question about the tax code. People get excited about the income level number, but the rest of the federal government can accommodate the cost of living concept. Why can't the tax code accommodate that?
Question was, why can't the
tax code accommodate the cost of living? Because obviously the cost of living in different parts of the country is different, so $250,000 would be vastly different in Toledo than in Washington.
I guess the question is, why don't you use the different standard for people in different parts of the country at the 250 versus, let's say, 230 or something?
Right.
The answer is?
I have to say that's a question I haven't thought about before. The tax code does have certain indexation in it. You know, certain provisions are indexed in the tax code for inflation. They're not regionally indexed. And we do have a very mobile society. People move across regions. I think it would be quite difficult to administer that type of a tax code. We are certainly open to looking at innovative solutions to problems. You know, I think as a labor economist, developing better measures of cost of living in different parts of the country can be very valuable for public policy. It's an interesting idea.
What about the death tax, I should say? You can talk about that. You think people will live longer if you have higher taxes on their death, that they just want to live longer, or you don't know?
I prefer to call it the estate tax.
Estate tax, okay. Alan, thank you very much. I want to give you a gift on behalf of the... Thank you. Map of the District of Columbia. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you. You know, my walls are pretty barren.
This is under your gift limit.
Senate is working today on what's called the Sportsman's Bill. It expands hunting and fishing on federal land. Members voted this morning to limit debate to 30 more hours. In the meantime, senators are in a quorum call waiting for a senator to come to the floor. Earlier today, Senator Tom Coburn released a report on possible defense spending cuts. While we wait for a senator to speak, a look at Senator Coburn's news conference.
Well, good morning. How's everybody? Well, good morning. How's everybody? Good morning. Great day to be in the neighborhood, isn't it? We're putting out a report today called the Department of Everything, and there's a little problem in terms of the Republican conference in terms of having a blind eye on spending. It's okay to cut spending anywhere except the Defense Department, and to be legitimate and have any integrity on the issue, you have to look, everything has to be on the table. And so what we've done, we've looked at the entire Pentagon, and this is just one section of it, on areas where the Pentagon works that has nothing to do with defense. And over 10 years, this is about $69 billion, and that's a very conservative estimate. At the end of World War II, we had 12 million men under arms. We had 2,000 flag officers and generals. Today we have 1,000 flag officers and generals and 1.2 million under arms. The ratio is totally out of whack. We almost now have an admiral for every ship in the Navy. It's not a captain, an admiral. So what we've done is go through and look at areas where we could not necessarily save all the money, but we could transfer responsibilities that are not truly the defense of the country out of the Pentagon and consolidate programs and save a significant amount of money. I think most of you all have, as a copy of the report's been released, so you've been able to see it. We highlight, as in every other agency, a lot of the stupid things that are happening. But I'll just highlight one individual thing. On 16 or 17 bases in the United States, we have military-run schools. The average cost to educate a child in that school per year is $50,000. Almost 4 times what the rest of public education costs. And the vast majority of our bases, we use public schools. We could take the money we're spending today, pay every public school system $14,000 per child, and save billions of dollars per year just on it, and with the same or better outcomes. So here's one area where we could save billions of dollars for the American taxpayer by doing what we do in the rest of the military. And we're not talking overseas. We're just talking domestically United States. And that's what the cost is. If you factor in overseas, it goes up a little bit higher. But the point is there's lots of areas where we can, in fact, make big savings in the Pentagon in areas that don't have anything to do with defense and cut the Pentagon's budget. And that has nothing to do with all the rest of the areas where we think we can save a ton of money in the Pentagon in terms of procurement modifications and just common sense application. So with that, let me take any questions that you might have, and we'll go over any areas that you might have concern. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Charlie Clark with Government Executive. Is there any clash between the ideas here and the desire to keep the volunteer army and make recruiting easier?
I don't think so at all. I don't think so at all. People don't join the Army because there's a school on base. Matter of fact, it's the minority of our bases that have a school on base. If, in fact, one of the things we have in here in terms of the grocery stores and PXs, you could actually give every family in the military $400 to $500 more for their groceries and save $8–9 billion a year for the Pentagon. And there'd be no difference in terms of the benefits to the military. You know, what we have not done is look specifically at areas where we could save money. You know, I'd go back. Is our country in trouble economically? Yes. Our generals tell us the greatest threat to our nation is not any foreign power, it's not the Middle East, it's not Al-Qaeda, it's our debt. And so everything has to be on the table. Every area of the Pentagon has to be on the table, as well as every area of the government. And we can do things much more efficiently, much more effectively, and probably better if we would take a new look at some of these areas. Yes.
Is this in any way intended to be sort of an olive branch in fiscal cliff negotiations, saying that Republicans are willing to put some defense spending on the table, now it's time for Democrats to come and bring something of their own from their sacred cow?
Well, I think, first of all, I think we need to talk about what has actually happened and undermine a little bit of the BS. There has been no real cuts yet to the Pentagon. There just hasn't been the hoped-for, desired increases in spending, and so therefore, if we didn't get the increase in spending, we call that a cut in Washington. And so that's where we are. Now, out of a $600 billion budget, couldn't you imagine that through efficiency, common sense, and just smart thinking, that we could save 5 to 7 to 8% of that? And the answer is absolutely. There isn't a military base that I go to around the world or in my own home state, there isn't an officer, general officer, or private that I've talked to that doesn't agree you could cut 10% out of the areas of their responsibility. Well, if that's the case, why are we not doing it? Why are we not taking those ideas and getting them filtered up? You know, I'd also remind you that we put forward before the break an audit the Pentagon bill. Because one of the biggest problems in the Pentagon is they have no idea where they're spending their money. And if you can't account for it, you can't measure it and you can't manage it. So we need to do a lot of work in the Pentagon. I'm a budget hawk, but I'm also a military hawk. I want us to have the best equipment, the best equipped military in the world. And if you look at what's happening on procurement in our military, what you're seeing is we're getting a whole lot less and spending a whole lot more in terms of capabilities. And that's all comes about in terms of our weapon system development and contracting, which is broken.
Why do you think the GOP has a blind eye to this kind of spending, and what can you do to make this report have traction with them and Congress at large?
Well, I'm doing what I can to make the report have traction, because I'm having a press conference today to try to get you all to read it and look at it, one, and say, is he right or is he way off base? And I'll take any fair criticism of what we've done. I think we've been looking at this for a year and a half. We wanted to put it out a year ago, and I wasn't pleased with it. I think all politicians have a blind area to the area that they espouse. You know, we have a blind area on Medicare in terms of waste, fraud, and abuse in Medicare. We have a blind area in terms of not incentivizing the proper things in terms of health care for Medicare. So I don't think Republicans have a blind eye when it comes to defense as a group. Others have a blind eye when it comes to saving some of our entitlement programs by not changing them. I think that's normal, but we're not normal times. We're in abnormal times. And if we're to secure the future, we need to be start thinking differently about how we approach the problems. And what I believe is everything ought to be on the table.
Senator Coburn, the Gang of Eight had another meeting this week. We still haven't seen a work product out of it. The White House, the President is meeting with the leadership now. What happened to the Gang of Eight? And is it time basically to say this is going to be up to the President and the congressional leadership, and the Gang of Eight is just not going to do it?
Well, first of all, I don't make comments about what we do and don't do in terms of our discussions in the Gang of Eight. But I would tell you that there's 8 individuals well-meaning wanting to get a deal, and it shows you how hard it is. And it's gotten harder after the election, as you can imagine. Positions have been firmed. You know, but let's go back. The president won the election. He's the leader of our country. It's time for him to say what he wants us to do, specifically, both in terms of tax reform, tax changes, revenue changes, but also entitlement reform and spending reform. You know, I'd remind you the size of the federal government's twice the size it was 11 years ago. I'm not sure we're getting twice the benefit. Yes, sir.
When you look through these different areas of spending, how much of this is inertia, and then meaning things just kind of build up over time, and how much of this is the responsibility of DOD versus the responsibility of Congress for putting in certain rules or certain mandates to say, let's look at X?
I think that's a great question. Let's divide it in 2 areas. Number one, Congress is a failure when it comes to oversight. I mean, and beneath that, we're a failure when we write legislation, because we give way too much authority and judgment to the bureaucracies. And the reason we do that is because we don't know what we're talking about, so we have to, because we're not up to speed in terms of level of knowledge about what we should be about when we legislate. So I think that's the first thing. It is Congress's responsibility to do the oversight. Now, the second point of that is there is some inertia, but that inertia comes from a lack of oversight. You know, one of the things that ought to be moved out of the Pentagon is all health research. I understand, if you know the story, the history on that, is Ted Stevens started that because they wanted a special project. And then ultimately, before he left, he was totally against special health research in the Pentagon, because he saw how it took funds away from the Pentagon and diverted it other than for the purpose. I mean, why should we be doing, I'm all for the breast cancer research that we're doing, but why should we be running it in the Pentagon? You know, we got Francis Collins, one of the leading scientists in the world, running NIH today, who's made major changes and major breakthroughs since he's been at the head of NIH. We can't trust our best professional to do all of our health research. We got to put it in the Pentagon, and then we got a layer of bureaucracy on top of it. I mean, you raise great points, but the fact is it doesn't get looked at, and so there is inertia. And so now we have a prostate program at the Pentagon, whereas the health research at the Pentagon ought to be about things that affect troops directly in terms of battle, infectious diseases, post-traumatic stress, the things that actually are impacting the health of our troops directly as a consequence of them being either deployed or a part of the military.
Senator, besides the requiring an audit legislation, do you have any other plans to try to make some of these recommendations a reality? For example, defense authorization bill might be coming to the floor as soon as today.
Well, it depends on if you can get any amendments. You know, and last year they cut off the amendments about halfway through. We'll offer a ton of amendments. We probably won't be allowed to get them heard. Again, that's the dysfunction of Washington. Not only do we not do oversight, we don't actually legislate properly on the floor in terms of having a position to have a chance to change something that obviously would benefit the country in the long run versus benefit the political process of moving a bill across the floor.
What of these recommendations are you going to try to get?
Well, I'm not going to comment on it, and that'll be a negotiation, because I'm sure we're not going to get every amendment we want. But there's a lot of things I'd like to see us do in the military outside of what the break. This is just a small part. This is just $6.9 billion a year. Just $6.9 billion a year. And not all of this would be savings, because some of it you'd be transferring out. So you probably got $4 billion a year in savings here. But that's $4 billion that you wouldn't take away from a procurement of aircraft or new rifles or new machine guns. Remember, we have some of the oldest weaponry for our troops in the world in terms of their hand-to-hand weapons. We're behind the rest of the world in terms of, So we're going to spend a whole lot more on things that don't have anything to do with our fighting men than things that do, when it comes to enabling them. So we'll proffer several amendments and see if we can have an opportunity to have them voted on and explained to the members. But again, I'd come back. Is it not the responsibility of every member of the Senate to be up to speed on where we spend the money in the Pentagon? Or is that just the Defense Authorization Committee and the Defense Appropriations Committee, and they're the only ones, and so you shouldn't know anything about it, given the fact that we're borrowing $50,000 a second in this country, every day, every second? You know, where does the responsibility lie? Should we not all be informed and knowledgeable about what's going on? Should we not insist that the Audit the Pentagon Act go through with the Defense Authorization Bill? I mean, you can't solve a problem if you don't know what the problem is, and if you can't audit the Pentagon and they don't know where they're spending money, how do you ever fix it? You don't. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Senator, what do you hope for from this lame duck? Do you think that there's a possibility, and I mean on the fiscal cliff sort of grand bargain issues, is it possible to get to a grand bargain, or is more likely that we'll do sort of the John Boehner down payment and then set up some process for next year?
I don't know the answer. My hope would be that we could reestablish the confidence that the people in Congress today are thinking about the long-term best interest of the country, not the short-term political interest of individuals or their parties, regardless of who won the election. What's the best thing we can do? You know, in the long run, we're going to fix all these problems because people are going to quit loaning us money. We're going to fix them. The question is how much pain do we go through before we fix them, and how much strife do the American people have as a result of us delaying the solution to these problems? You know, as a young person today, if you have any knowledge about what's going on in Washington, you've got to be seriously concerned about your future, in terms of your economic future, in terms of your freedom. And when the young generation comes up to a bubble of disappointment, when the expectations that they thought were there are not there, and they're not going to be there unless we actually do some things now, you're going to see some awfully disappointed people with some exaggerated behavior that's not going to be pretty. So it's not just about now. It's about what's coming. All you got to do is look at what's happening in Southern Europe right now. We're not all that far away from that, because there's going to come a time when the cost of borrowing will be so great that we won't be able to borrow, and the forced austerity will be placed upon us. And what I would say is we ought to be doing that now before that happens, rather than when somebody else is telling us what we're going to do. All right, thank you all very much.